Chapter 2, Part 2 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gail Mattern. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Chapter 2, Up the Paraguay, Part 2. On the Brazilian boundary we met a shallow river steamer carrying Colonel Candido Mariano da Silva Rondon and several other Brazilian members of the expedition. Colonel Rondon immediately showed that he was all, and more than all, that could be desired. It was evident that he knew his business thoroughly, and it was equally evident that he would be a pleasant companion. He was a classmate of Mr. Lauro Muller at the Brazilian Military Academy. He is of almost pure Indian blood, and is a positivist. The positivists are a really strong body in Brazil, as they are in France and indeed in Chile. The colonel's 7 children have all been formally made members of the Positivist Church in Rio Janeiro. Brazil possesses the same complete liberty in matters religious, spiritual, and intellectual as we, for our great good fortune, do in the United States, and my Brazilian companions included Catholics and equally sincere men who described themselves as libre penseurs. Colonel Rondon has spent the last 24 years in exploring the western highlands of Brazil, pioneering the way for telegraph lines and railroads. During that time he has traveled some 14,000 miles, on territory most of which had not previously been traversed by civilized man, and has built 3,000 miles of telegraph. He has an exceptional knowledge of the Indian tribes, and has always zealously endeavored to serve them, and indeed to serve the cause of humanity, wherever and whenever he was able. Thanks mainly to his efforts, 4 of the wild tribes of the region he has explored have begun to tread the road of civilization. They have taken the first steps toward becoming Christians. It may seem strange that among the first fruits of the efforts of a positivist should be the conversion of those he seeks to benefit to Christianity. But in South America Christianity is at least as much a status as a theology. It represents the indispensable first step upward from savagery. In the wilder and poorer districts, men are divided into the 2 great classes of Christians and Indians. When an Indian becomes a Christian, he is accepted into and becomes wholly absorbed or partly assimilated by the crude and simple neighboring civilization, and then he moves up or down, like anyone else among his fellows. Among Colonel Rondon's companions were Captain Amilcar de Magalhães, Lieutenant Yao Lira, Lieutenant Joaquim de Mayo Filho, and Dr. Eusebio de Oliveira, a geologist. The steamers halted. Colonel Rondon and several of his officers, spick and span in their white uniforms, came aboard, and in the afternoon I visited him on his steamer to talk over our plans. When these had been fully discussed and agreed on, we took tea. I happened to mention that one of our naturalists, Miller, had been bitten by a piranha, and the man-eating fish at once became the subject of conversation. Curiously enough, one of the Brazilian taxidermists had also just been severely bitten by a piranha. My new companions had story after story to tell of them. Only 3 weeks previously a 12-year-old boy who had gone in swimming near Corumba was attacked and literally devoured alive by them. Colonel Rondon, during his exploring trips, had met with more than one unpleasant experience in connection with them. He had lost one of his toes by the bite of a piranha. He was about to bathe, and had chosen a shallow pool at the edge of the river, which he carefully inspected until he was satisfied that none of the man-eating fish were in it. Yet as soon as he put his foot into the water, one of them attacked him and bit off a toe. On another occasion, while wading across a narrow stream, one of his party was attacked. The fish bit him on the thighs and buttocks, and when he put down his hands, tore them also. He was near the bank, and by a rush reached it, and swung himself out of the water by means of an overhanging limb of a tree, but he was terribly injured, and it took him 6 months before his wounds healed and he recovered. An extraordinary incident occurred on another trip. The party were without food and very hungry. On reaching a stream they dynamited it, and waded in to seize the stunned fish as they floated on the surface. One man, Lieutenant Pyreneus, having his hands full, tried to hold one fish by putting its head into his mouth. It was a piranha and seemingly stunned, but in a moment it recovered and bit a big section out of his tongue. Such a hemorrhage followed that his life was saved with the utmost difficulty. On another occasion a member of the party was off by himself on a mule. The mule came into camp alone. Following his track back, they came to a ford, where in the water they found the skeleton of the dead man, his clothes uninjured, but every particle of flesh stripped from his bones. Whether he had drowned, and the fishes had then eaten his body, or whether they had killed him, it was impossible to say. They had not hurt the clothes, getting in under them, which made it seem likely that there had been no struggle. These man-eating fish are a veritable scourge in the waters they frequent. But it must not be understood by this that the piranhas, or, for the matter of that, the New World caimans and crocodiles, ever become such dreaded foes of man as, for instance, the man-eating crocodiles of Africa. Accidents occur, and there are certain places where swimming and bathing are dangerous, but in most places the people swim freely, although they are usually careful to find spots they believe safe, or else to keep together and make a splashing in the water. During his trips Colonel Rondon had met with various experiences with wild creatures. The Paraguayan caimans are not ordinarily dangerous to man, but they do sometimes become man-eaters, and should be destroyed whenever the opportunity offers. The huge caimans and crocodiles of the Amazon are far more dangerous, and the colonel knew of repeated instances where men, women, and children had become their victims. Once, while dynamiting a stream for fish for his starving party, he partially stunned a giant anaconda, which he killed as it crept slowly off. He said that it was of a size that no other anaconda he had ever seen even approached, and that, in his opinion, such a brute, if hungry, would readily attack a full-grown man. Twice smaller anacondas had attacked his dogs. One was carried under water, for the anaconda is a water-loving serpent, but he rescued it. One of his men was bitten by a jararaca. He killed the venomous snake, but was not discovered and brought back to camp until it was too late to save his life. The puma Colonel Rondon had found to be as cowardly as I have always found it, but the jaguar was a formidable beast, which occasionally turned man-eater, and often charged savagely when brought to bay. He had known a hunter to be killed by a jaguar he was following in thick grass cover. All such enemies, however, he regarded as utterly trivial compared to the real dangers of the wilderness, the torment and menace of attacks by the swarming insects, by mosquitoes, and the even more intolerable tiny gnats, by the ticks, and by the vicious poisonous ants, which occasionally cause villages and even whole districts to be deserted by human beings. These insects and the fevers they cause, and dysentery, and starvation, and wearing hardship, and accidents in rapids, are what the pioneer explorers have to fear. The conversation was to me most interesting. The colonel spoke French, about to the extent I did, but of course he and the others preferred Portuguese, and then Kermit was the interpreter. In the evening, soon after moonrise, we stopped for wood at the little Brazilian town of Porto Martino. There are about 1,200 inhabitants. Some of the buildings were of stone. A large private house with a castellated tower was of stone. There were shops and a post office, stores, a restaurant and billiard hall, and warehouses for mate, of which much is grown in the region round about. Most of the houses were low, with overhanging, sloping caves, and there were gardens with high walls, inside of which trees rose, many of them fragrant. We wandered through the wide dusty streets and along the narrow sidewalks. It was a hot, still evening. The smell of the tropics was on the heavy December air. Through the open doors and windows we caught dim glimpses of the half-clad inmates of the poorer houses. Women and young girls sat outside their thresholds in the moonlight. All whom we met were most friendly. The captain of the little Brazilian garrison, the intendant, a local trader, another trader and ranchman, a Uruguayan who had just received his newspaper containing my speech in Montevideo, and who, as I gathered from what I understood of his rather voluble Spanish, was much impressed by my views on democracy, honesty, liberty, and order, rather well-worn topics, and a Catalan who spoke French, and who was accompanied by his pretty daughter, a dear little girl of 8 or 10, who said with much pride that she spoke 3 languages, Brazilian, Spanish, and Catalan. Her father expressed strongly his desire for a church and for a school in the little city. When at last the wood was aboard, we resumed our journey. The river was like glass. In the white moonlight, the palms on the edge of the banks stood mirrored in the still water. We sat forward, and as we rounded the curves, the long silver reaches of the great stream stretched ahead of us, and the ghostly outlines of hills rose in the distance. Here and there prairie fires burned, and the red glow warred with the moon's radiance. Next morning was overcast. Occasionally we passed a wood yard or factory or cabin, now on the eastern, the Brazilian, now on the western, the Paraguayan, bank. The Paraguay was known to men of European birth, bore soldiers and priests and merchants as they sailed and rowed up and down the current of its stream, and beheld little towns and forts rise on its bank, long before the Mississippi had become the white man's highway. Now, along its upper course, the settlements are much like those on the Mississippi at the end of the first quarter of the last century, and in the not distant future it will witness a burst of growth and prosperity much like that which the Mississippi saw when the old men of today were very young. In the early forenoon we stopped at a little Paraguayan hamlet nestling in the green growth under a group of low hills by the river brink. On one of these hills stood a picturesque old stone fort, known as Fort Bourbon in the Spanish, the colonial days. Now the Paraguayan flag floats over it, and it is garrisoned by a handful of Paraguayan soldiers. Here Father Zam baptized 2 children, the youngest of a large family of fair-skinned, light-haired, small people, whose father was a Paraguayan, and the mother an Oriental or Uruguayan. No priest had visited the village for 3 years, and the children were commandant and a married couple from Austria. In answer to what was supposed to be the perfunctory question whether they were Catholics, the parents returned the unexpected answer that they were not. Further questioning elicited the fact that the father called himself a free-thinking Catholic, and the mother said she was a Protestant Catholic, her mother having been a Protestant, the daughter of an immigrant from Normandy. However, it appeared that the older children had been baptized by the Bishop of Asuncion, so Father Zam, at the earnest request of the parents, proceeded with the ceremony. They were good people, and although they wished liberty to think exactly as they individually pleased, they also wished to be connected and to have their children connected with some church, by preference the church of the majority of their people. A very short experience of communities where there is no church ought to convince the most heterodox of the absolute need of a church. I earnestly wish that there could be such an increase in the personnel and equipment of the Catholic Church in South America as to permit the establishment of one good and earnest priest in every village or little community in the far interior. Nor is there any inconsistency between this wish and the further wish that there could be a marked extension and development of the native Protestant churches, such as I saw established here and there in Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina, and of the YMC associations. The bulk of these good people who profess religion will continue to be Catholics, but the spiritual needs of a more or less considerable minority will best be met by the establishment of Protestant churches, or in places even of a positivist church or ethical culture society. Not only is the establishment of such churches a good thing for the body politic as a whole, but a good thing for the Catholic Church itself. for their presence is a constant spur to activity and clean and honorable conduct, and a constant reflection on sloth and moral laxity. The government in each of these commonwealths is doing everything possible to further the cause of education, and the tendency is to treat education as peculiarly a function of government, and to make it, where the government acts, non-sectarian, obligatory, and free, a cardinal doctrine of our own great democracy, to which we are committed by every principle of sound Americanism. There must be absolute religious liberty, for tyranny and intolerance are as abhorrent in matters intellectual and spiritual as in matters political and material, and more we must all realize that conduct is of infinitely greater importance than dogma. But no democracy can afford to overlook the vital importance of the ethical and spiritual, the truly religious element in life. And in practice the average good man grows clearly to understand this, and to express the need in concrete form by saying that no community can make much headway if it does not contain both a church and a school. We took breakfast, the 11 o'clock Brazilian breakfast, on Colonel Rondon's boat. Caimans were becoming more plentiful. The ugly brutes lay on the sand flats and mud banks like logs, always with the head raised, sometimes with the jaws open. They are often dangerous to domestic animals, and are always destructive to fish, and it is good to shoot them. I killed half a dozen, and missed nearly as many more. A throbbing boat does not improve one's aim. We passed forests of palms that extended for leagues, and vast marshy meadows where storks, herons, and ibis were gathered, with flocks of cormorants and darters on the sandbars, and stilts, skimmers, and clouds of beautiful swaying terns in the foreground. About noon we passed the highest point which the old Spanish conquistadors and explorers, Ayala and Ayolas, had reached in the course of their marvelous journeys in the first half of the 16th century, at a time when there was not a settlement in what is now the United States, and when hardly a single English sea captain had ventured so much as to cross the Atlantic. By the following day the country on the east bank had become a vast marshy plain, dotted here and there by tree-clad patches of higher land. The morning was rainy, a contrast to the fine weather we had hitherto encountered. We passed wood yards and cattle ranches. At one of the latter the owner, an Argentine of Irish parentage, who still spoke English with the accent of the land of his parents' nativity, remarked that this was the first time the American flag had been seen on the upper Paraguay, for our gunboat carried it at the masthead. Early in the afternoon, having reached the part where both banks of the river were Brazilian territory, we came to the old colonial Portuguese fort of Coimbra. It stands where two steep hills rise, one on either side of the river, and it guards the water gorge between them. It was captured by the Paraguayans in the war of nearly half a century ago. Some modern guns have been mounted, and there is a garrison of Brazilian troops. The white fort is perched on the hillside, where it clings and rises, terrace above terrace, with bastion and parapet and crenellated wall. At the foot of the hill, on the riverine plain, stretches the old-time village with its roofs of palm. In the village dwell several hundred souls, almost entirely the officers and soldiers and their families. There is one long street. The one-story daub and wattle houses have low eaves and steep, sloping roofs of palm leaves or of split palm trunks. Under one or two old but small trees there are rude benches, and for a part of the length of the street there is a rough stone sidewalk. A little graveyard, some of the tombs very old, stands at one end. As we passed down the street the wives and the swarming children of the garrison were at the doors and windows. There were women and girls with skins as fair as any in the Northland, and others that were predominantly Negro. Most were of intervening shades. All this was paralleled among the men, and the fusion of the colors was going on steadily. Around the village black vultures were gathered. Not long before reaching it, we passed some rounded green trees, their tops covered with the showy wood ibis. At the same time we saw behind them, farther inland, other trees crowded with the more delicate forms of the shining white egrets. The river now widened, so that in places it looked like a long lake. It wound in every direction through the endless marshy plain, whose surface was broken here and there by low mountains. The splendor of the sunset I never saw surpassed. We were streaming east towards clouds of storm. The river ran, a broad highway of molten gold, into the flaming sky. The far-off mountains loomed purple across the marshes. Belts of rich green, the river banks stood out on either side against the rose hues of the rippling water. In front, as we forged steadily onward, hung the tropic night, dim and vast. On December 15th we reached Corumba. For 3 or 4 miles before it is reached, the west bank on which it stands becomes high rocky ground, falling away into cliffs. The country round about was evidently well peopled. We saw gauchos, cattle herders, the equivalent of our own cowboys, riding along the bank. Women were washing clothes, and their naked children bathing. On the shore we were told that caimans and piranhas rarely ventured near a place where so much was going on, and that accidents generally occurred in ponds or lonely stretches of the river. Several steamers came out to meet us and accompanied us for a dozen miles, with bands playing and the passengers cheering, just as if we were nearing some town on the Hudson. Corumba is on a steep hillside, with wide, roughly paved streets, some of them lined with beautiful trees that bear scarlet flowers, and with well-built houses, most of them of 1 story, some of 2 or 3 stories. We were greeted with a reception by the municipal council, and were given a state dinner. The hotel, kept by an Italian, was as comfortable as possible. Stone floors, high ceilings, big windows and doors, a cool open courtyard, and a shower bath. Of course, Corumba is still a frontier town. The vehicles, ox carts and mule carts. There are no carriages, and oxen as well as mules are used for riding. The water comes from a big central well. Around it the water carts gather, and their contents are then peddled around at the different houses. The families showed the mixture of races characteristic of Brazil. One mother, after the children had been photographed in their ordinary costume, begged that we return and take them in their Sunday clothes, which was accordingly done. In a year the railway from Rio will reach Corumba, and then this city and the country round about will see much development. At this point we rejoined the rest of the party, and very glad we were to see them. Cherry and Miller had already collected some 800 specimens of mammals and birds. End of Chapter 2.